adopting white people. It's like, yeah, they don't know where the mountains come from. They don't know where the rivers go to. They don't know how to live peaceably, productively in the land. It's constantly exploit, abuse, and then abandon, and then go somewhere else. And then we go all over the world doing that because we run out of things to do here. We have to adopt these white people who have separation anxiety from having left Europe and very poor parenting as runaways in this country and have never learned to work and live constructively, organically on this land. And I said, wow, that's exactly what I was thinking. Were you overhearing me somewhere, Mr. Mark Charles? I couldn't agree more. And we like to think of ourselves as the most powerful, most sophisticated, the greatest country on earth. And I do love this country. This is my country. I'm a citizen here. I love living here. But that kind of superiority complex is really childish, isn't it? Only little kids say, my daddy can beat up your daddy, and that's just kind of the psychology of this country. It doesn't matter if it's 100, 200, 300 years, it just seems to be we're seen perpetually to be toddlers in their terrible twos. And how do we get all of us to grow up is the question, instead of fighting for diminishing resources. We have to help our people to understand that the Bible is a political text. That sounds kind of weird. Of course it's a spiritual text, but by political text meaning God is sovereign over everything, including real politics, real economics, real life. And anybody who believes that God is just the God of the spiritual world that's a very, very impoverished God. That's a really reduced God. My God is sovereign. My God is God over all. King of kings, Lord of lords, over all presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers and Department of Defense. My God is God over all. And this Bible, what I see in this Bible is a story of a small group of people who were the most despised people throughout history in their time. And they did some good things in Egypt. Remember Joseph and how he saved the country, basically, because he was shrewd. But a few generations later, all of their hard work and sacrifice was written out of the Egyptian narrative. After a few generations, the Egyptian elite forgot about the contribution of the Jewish people, intentionally wrote them out of history. Does it sound like Native American history here? Would white people be here were it not for the hospitality, the generosity, the kindness, the extension of humanity to white settlers here? And yet we have written Native Americans completely out of our history. Somehow we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? And these these Israelites then went over to Palestine, and they faced all kinds of threatening peoples there. And they had to contend with the Hittite Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Greek Empire that was split up, and then the Roman Empire. And Jesus came in the midst of the most heavy-handed empire in the Jewish people's history. The entire Bible is a chronicle of a small group of people, a despised group of people, trying to be faithful to the kingdom of God in the midst of oppressive empires that had its way with his people. Revelation is about the Roman Empire, but the Apostle John could not get it out of the prison island of Patmos if he criticized Rome directly, so he called Rome the whore of Babylon. And he described the greatest persecution of Christians in that time, which was by Nero, and so he called Nero 666, which those letters in Greek spell out 666. And another version is Neron, which spells 616. So the early manuscripts had 666 or 616, which only proves that this was a reference to Nero. And so the Roman censors couldn't make sense of it. Whore of Babylon, what the heck, and just let it out. And that's how the letters got around. Genesis is just a prologue. It's just the introduction to the history of God's people navigating faithfulness to this kingdom, which is not yet fully come, and trying to make it survive in oppressive empires one after the other. Why have we not understood the Bible as a chronicle of a faithful band of oppressed people contending with empire? Why? Because we're the empire. It does not serve us to read the Bible through a post-imperial, post-colonial lens. because then we would know just how much American Christians are the foot soldiers of American empire. Are we the greatest people on the face of the earth? Are we the greatest country in the world? Or are we the most successful barbarians ever to appear? I know something about barbarians. I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan, y'all. We idolize, we glorify barbarians where I'm from. That's right. But you know, one definition of barbarism is just crudity. But the other definition of what it means to be barbaric is the inability of a group of people to live sustainably on a given piece of territory. So they go marauding from one city to another, from one country to another, from one people group to another, raping, pillaging, killing, destroying, and when they are done doing their locust thing, then they move on. I really want to ask, is America the most civilized country in the world, or just the most successfully barbaric country in the world? If we don't understand our own story, then what is God's good news about? If we cannot confess the bad news that we have somehow unwittingly become complicit in, what the heck are we actually confessing? And if the church doesn't speak the language of confession, then we're not speaking anything worth speaking at all. Confession is the language of the church. It is God's gift of humility, of honesty, of truth. Confession about our real story, about our real history, about our real identity liberates us from shame and leads us to true salvation, redemption, and transformation. We need to tell the true story of who we are and then let God take away our shame. But here's the problem. White American identity requires individualism. So, my goodness, I could talk for hours about the shame of being Korean. 5,000 years of an oppressed minority vis-a-vis the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, you know, even though all those people came from us at some point. Hyperbole. Well, when you're inferior, you got to counter that with a superior statement. But we have this deep inferiority complex, and so we're strivers, we're survivors and strivers all over the world. And that's a very shameful thing in my opinion. But by confessing it, I'm liberated from it, right? So when we confess the actual history and identity of our country, we become liberated from it. But for me, when I talk about the shame of my country, of my people, 5,000 years of humiliation, I can do it because I have millions of fellow Korean people who share collectively in that shame and who participate in the redemption too. But in American mythos, if anybody comes to that kind of awareness, that consciousness, and they decide to take collective responsibility, then because of individualism, there's no one to share that shame with. The entire weight of American history becomes crushingly bearing down on one individual, and we can't bear it.